The Innkeeper by Life Sketcher. Chapter 721 Audits. In the few minutes after Warhile's victory, a little over 120,000 fights broke out between overly emotional guests. Of course, they did not break out all at once, and they were of varying levels of intensity. Predictably, most of them were started or at least instigated by those who were strongly affiliated with the Empire. A majority of the fights were stopped before the first blow even landed, and each individual was fined and threatened with expulsion if they continued such behavior. Some of the fights between the stronger guests were not so easy to stop and took a couple of moments, which was enough to cause some collateral damage. Fortunately, no one was really harmed, with most of the damage being dealt to the environment. These people were all fined, as well as expelled from the inn, with a temporary ban of 1 month. On that note, Lex was extremely grateful for the ability to ban guests from coming back into the inn. When he first started out, he had no influence on who could enter the inn. There was one particular fight, however, that did threaten to cause massive damage. It was one of the generals of the Empire, who was unable to listen to the demeaning dribble of a gloating devil. As a heaven immortal himself, it would have been tough to control him. Fortunately, Yon himself put a stop to that fight before it really started. The countless guards that had been hired once again flashed their aura for a moment to serve as a deterrent, but during such an emotional time, its effect was going to be minimal. Many guests departed, following in the footsteps of Warhile himself, but many remained to celebrate or mourn at the inn. Others still decided to explore the inn a bit, as they were arriving for the first time. But the inn, which had the current capacity to provide services other than a simple room to a few million at most, was severely overcrowded. With no other choice, Lex had to spend billions of MP more to create more temporary cities and hire temporary workers to funnel all these guests into. It had to be said that his very few draconian apostle workers, the second race of workers he had, really outdid themselves in such an environment. The more pressure they were under, the better they performed. Moreover, regardless of how hazardous he made the environment in the temporary zones, they were able to cope. Lex had become too used to running the inn on autopilot, but during the next 2 days, he barely got a moment of rest. The inn was grossly underprepared to handle such a huge crowd, and not just because of the size of his management team. The low cultivation levels of his workers was a fundamental problem that needed to be overcome, but could not be solved in the short term. Almost all of his workers were at least in the Chi training realm by now, with those who had gone through at least 1-star rank change at the Foundation realm. But that was it. Almost none had yet surpassed that realm. Unbelievably, Lex was actually looking forward to the time when the inn would stop accepting guests because he really needed some time for his staff to grow. With most of his guests at the Golden Core realm, and many more at realms even higher, he could only continue to rely on external security for now. During this time, Lex had spent a rounded figure of 90 billion MP in making temporary cities, hiring more security, and taking care of other miscellaneous issues. The inn had also once again run out of all the spiritual food they had grown, and so were once again serving only mortal food which the system provided, which was not appreciated by some. But despite the heavy expenditure, he had earned 200 billion during the same time. That meant, after deducting his expenses, Lex made 110 billion MP. That was not even counting the rent MP he made on the first day. It was finally on the third day that the number of guests finally dropped below 500 million, and Lex was able to relax. Instead of going to his office, or even meditation room, Lex found himself in his hot tub room to unwind. He really needed it. The first half hour, he barely even realized that he was in the hot tub. His mind was still too active, going over the various tasks he had handled the past 2 days. Unbelievably, besides the fight between the two heavenly immortals, the most popular thing at the inn had been the spaceship daycare service. He really ought to give the bunnies running that a raise or something. But, eventually, his mind slowly relaxed and he was able to free himself from the thoughts of work. Work at the inn never finished, and there would always be more things for him to take care of. But he had some of his own tasks to do. Well, technically, he only needed to go get that treasure that mystery man told him about, and maybe check up on Alexander. He was somewhat curious about the details of the poisonous substance he had discovered. If it had made him sick just by being exposed to the air around it, after it was already sealed, he could not even imagine how dangerous it really was. There was also that event hosted by Vera coming up, the one meant for prophets and oracles, but he did not expect that to be a problem, since he had handled bigger events before. If only he knew that even as he sat there, relaxing, countless oracles were traveling to the origin realm from other realms, just because that was where the golden keys to the inn were available. After Lex finally felt like he had recovered mentally somewhat, he left the hot tub and went to cultivate. He had already missed 2 days due to how busy things were. He could not miss another day just because he felt tired. He continued to absorb the various materials he had gathered, upgrading his foundation bit by bit. Even if he spent hours doing this, when he could actually feel himself growing stronger, Lex never tired of cultivation. Once he was done, Lex finally went to bed. Although at his level the need for sleep was greatly diminished, after such hectic days all without any rest, even he needed a nap. When he woke up, he checked the inn to make sure all was well. Things were not perfect, as he still had around 400 million guests, way too many for the inn's capacity, but the temporary cities were keeping things running for now. Since there was no emergency, he decided to head out. Before he returned to X-142, though, he decided to check up on Abruptly once. It had been a while since Alexander communicated with him, so he wanted to check up on things. He teleported to the planet, reappearing in the wilderness where he previously left from. A scan of the area with his spirit sense revealed that he was alone, so he tried to contact Alexander through the local equivalent of a phone, something he had kept in his spatial bangle, but discovered that he could not connect. Lex frowned. This was not Earth, and the technology he was using was supposed to not experience any issues like connectivity problems. Something was amiss. Since his instincts weren't warning him of any danger nearby, Lex decided to first investigate the fort he was previously staying at. Maybe he could learn something over there. Not to mention, he still had not investigated if the local rebel leader was cooperating with the terrorists Alexander was after. He was not worried his previous identity would suffer any extra suspicion, for he really hadn't done anything or appeared anywhere else on the planet. Even if they tried to investigate him, the rebels would not get anywhere. Elsewhere on Abruptly, 2 men casually walked around as if the planet was not at war. In that respect, they behaved much like Lex. Yet there was also a difference between them. When the two walked through crowded streets or passed by other people, no one seemed to notice them. One of the men was holding a clipboard and was taking note of various things. But what was strange was that he did not seem to be observing the people or the buildings. In fact, none of his observations seemed to have anything to do with the locals. Instead, he seemed to be observing the flow of energy and its density, among other things. Auditor Ripley, as you can see, the Henali have been very careful in maintaining an organic growth of this realm. There are strict laws to ensure the realm grows under the best of conditions. Be that as it may, a few anomalies have been detected as of late in this realm. Although I do not doubt you, Monsieur Hennessy, or the Henali, the Versailles Bank has protocols that need to be followed. But do not fret, the Henali have a stellar reputation. I have no doubt that there won't be anything amiss for me to report. Chapter 722 Parents' Trap. John, an old member of the inn and the local assassin who had not gone assassinating for a very long time, finally reappeared at the Midnight Inn. After months, he had finally won his life or death duel, yet he did not look even remotely happy, but one would have to look past his bloody figure to notice his expression. His right arm, which he had used to deliver his final blow, had been completely eviscerated, and ended in a stump right above his elbow. While he was missing no other limbs, that did not mean he was unhurt. Typically, as an immortal, he would have a very strong healing ability, and would not have to go to a common place like the recovery room, but that is exactly what he did. Or at least tried to do, for his feeble body was completely lacking the once devastating strength it had. But all was not lost. A member of the security team suddenly appeared next to him, and teleported him right to the recovery room without asking any questions. As John's bleeding and battered body was carried in, there was only one injury John was worried about, and that was the injury to his system. He was not sure how it happened, or what his opponent had done, but his system had completely stopped working, and with it the cultivation it had granted John had vanished too. In John's eyes, there was only a hopeless desperation. As unusual as it was, as one immortal was being taken to the recovery room, another one was walking out. Ragnar bore no sign of the devastating loss he had suffered, and had healed completely as one would actually expect of an immortal. But just as he was not frustrated or disappointed by his loss, he was not excited about his recovery. With an even pace, he walked to the Chamber of Secrets, where Emperor Jotun was waiting for him. "How is everything?" the Emperor asked, his voice devoid of an urgency or concern as well. "As you speculated, Warhile cursed my body. If it is not removed, I will likely turn into a zombie," Ragnar said as calmly as if he was speaking of the weather. "I'm sorry you had to bear this loss," the Emperor said with some genuine emotion in his voice, finally. "But this is much too important. With a curse directly from the source, and one powerful enough to affect an immortal, we can finally find a way to reverse it." "Just don't fail," again a third voice interrupted the two. They looked over to find a female zombie avidly reading a book. Gladius, the owner of the book club taking place at the inn, had finally given her the correct book to read. Reading a novel really was more interesting than plumbing manuals. She should have reached such a conclusion on her own, but such basic common sense sometimes eluded her now that she had become a zombie. "Ragnar, I'd like you to meet my daughter, Clarissa Jotun. Like you, she too suffered from a curse that eventually turned her into a zombie. Yet her curse was not from the source, Warhile. So while studying it and attempting to reverse it allowed Clarissa to retain her soul and consciousness, it did not stop the transformation. But we learned a lot during her transformation. I'm completely confident that now, with your help, and with the information we gathered from her, we will be able to finally find a cure. For the betterment of humanity, I do not mind bearing the humiliation of defeat and the threat of a curse. I look forward to ridding the universe of zombies once and for all." For a moment, Clarissa paused and looked up at Ragnar. She could not help but admire how good he looked, then she looked down again. Suppressing her urge to eat living cultivators was hard sometimes. While externally he did not show it, internally, Jotun was quite pleased. While his intention to find a cure for the zombie curse was real, his main motive was to get Ragnar and Clarissa to spend more time together. This is what he called a parent's trap. Alexander had a grim look on his face as he stared directly at a number of his superiors, as well as the head of his team, Valkyrie. He was under a lot of pressure, but at the same time, he was completely relaxed, for he knew what lines he would not cross. In this interrogation, where he was the one being interrogated, he had been searched and deprived of all his golden keys as well as other treasures. It was so that he would not try and escape to the inn or cause any problems. Yet they overlooked the fact that he was above level 2 prestige membership at the Midnight Inn. That meant once every 10 years, he could directly teleport to the inn without the need for a key. To be clear, this was a separate privilege from the one he used to teleport to Vegas Minima, which was the perk he got for being at level 3. Like I said, I cannot, nor will I, reveal the identity of my agent. Yet I can guarantee that he was not the one who planted the hazardous material. According to the cover identity you created, your agent is only in the Golden Core realm. How can he possibly survive and even come back well enough to give a report when none of our agents have survived even coming close? It took immortal level involvement to deduce that there is some extremely hazardous material hidden at the designated site, and even then it was not a clear answer. How can a Golden Core cultivator survive where even an immortal did not succeed? Alexander sighed. He did not blame them for being suspicious, but by grilling him they were just wasting time. It would have been better spent trying to identify whatever that material really was. At the same time, a part of him really could not help but applaud Lex for surviving when literally everyone else who came close died. It was an incredible feat. Chapter 723 All is well, until it isn't. It did not take long for Lex to find his way to the fort, which was acting as a refugee camp. He was half expecting to find it destroyed, and the surrounding region embodied in war. After all, when did he ever encounter things that were simple? Moreover, with Alexander's long silence, and his communication device not working, a full planet-wide war was only the natural assumption one would make, right? As it were, no such event was taking place. The fort was operating as usual, and when he tried to enter, he was given no extra attention. After all, his casual attitude and overall clean appearance had attracted enough attention last time to make an impression. He was not even secretly followed as he entered the fort. Spreading his spirit sense carefully, he listened in on the conversations taking place around him to see what the current situation was. The situation was not exactly ideal as there was still a war going on, but there was nothing out of the ordinary. Fernando, the rebel leader Alexander wanted investigated, had once again led a very successful strike against one of the local garrisons, strengthening their own position while weakening the official governments. While he was here, Lex considered trying the investigation again. Sure, his stealthy suit that he had manufactured after his defensive suit on its own probably wouldn't hide him from high-leveled cultivators, but he was willing to give it a try. Learning a proper stealth technique was still on his agenda. He decided to try and investigate the very same night. He was also curious to see if the rebels knew about the hidden dangers under their walls. Maybe it was a failsafe they planned in case the fort was ever taken over. He returned to the same tavern he was staying at earlier, and decided to get some food while he waited. Lex appeared completely casual, as if he was still getting used to his new realm and had no intention of getting involved with the war. He saw a few familiar faces from when he had previously stayed there, and began catching up with them. Keeping up his cover's identity and relations as important, as he never knew when they could come in handy. A few hours later, as evening was coming to a close, Lex was sitting at a table with a group of locals, playing a card game. It was both entertaining and relaxing, and could be considered work at the same time. How ideal was that? All was normal, until Lex felt something strange. It was not just his instincts that picked up an anomaly, but the very energy within him. The new nameless cultivation technique had explained his existing affinity to him, so he now knew that besides an affinity for space, he could interact with laws in general as well. That did not mean he had an affinity for all laws, just that he gained the ability to somewhat interact with them. This in itself was a tremendous ability, as it was something he should not have attained until he became an actual immortal. At the same time, what he could do with it was also very limited and situational. But, as it happened, Lex encountered just such a situation where his affinity was triggered. Laws were not rare, and existed across every inch of the universe, as far as Lex understood it. He was not too clear about when or how he would be able to interact with laws, but it was definitely not with the laws embedded in the fibers of the universe he encountered every day. Yet at that moment, he encountered an anomaly in the laws surrounding where he was. It was that disturbance he felt, using his affinity, that was weakly triggering his instincts. He looked across the tavern towards one of the walls. Nothing special seemed to be happening there, but as it happened, behind the wall in that very direction a short distance away, two men appeared. One of them was holding a clipboard and taking notes, while the other was smiling and pleasantly chatting with the man. They were not doing anything unusual, and Lex could not detect them entirely either. But his instincts were definitely picking up something, and the feeling was quite ominous. He frowned, and put down his cards. At the table, everyone turned to look at him, curious about what he was doing, but Lex could not be bothered. "Something is wrong," he warned softly, before quickly departing. The feedback from his instincts was unusual, and he could not decide if it was danger or something else he was sensing. He decided to investigate carefully. In space, above the planet Polbitvi, Jeffrey was standing inside a small, invisible ship. He was smiling widely as he looked down on the planet, and whatever he saw made him feel even happier. He wanted to smile even wider, but he physically was limited from doing it. Suddenly his face distorted, and the grin became even wider as his lips fell off his face. But instantly he returned back to normal, and began patting his face, making sure it was okay. He couldn't give up his identity as a human just yet, and it took quite a bit of effort every time he disguised himself, so he had to restrain himself. Ah, the hubris of the powerful. I love taking advantage of it, he spoke to no one in particular. Then, with a look of reluctance, he turned away. As much as he wanted to continue watching, things were about to get heated. He had to leave this galaxy before someone tracked him down. The VIPs are in place. Deliver the welcome present, he continued to speak, though no one else was on the ship with him. A few minutes later, the ship teleported far away. At the same time, one of the barrels of void wood hidden under the fort wall cracked. Holy shit! Lex could not help but curse as his instincts screamed death. Teleporting back to the inn, ironically, was not quick enough since his return was always slower than that of guests. Using his complete strength, and then some, Lex bolted in the opposite direction of the wall. Chapter 724 Eco-Terrorists. There was no explosion. There was no eruption force that could tear open the earth under which the barrels were buried, and there was no clap of thunder to warn those in the vicinity of the impending danger. Yet the danger was still there, and arguably even more lethal than an explosion. Lex's abrupt escape immediately attracted attention, and all the guards and soldiers immediately focused on him, as if he were some criminal. As soon as he moved, some of the soldiers began moving to intercept him, but was Lex someone easily cornered? Earlier, he would have relied only on his instincts to guide him, but in this moment, where his body was strained to the maximum amount for survival, he began to notice all the new changes in him. Regal Embrace was about defense, and Mo's Blessing about offense. Lex decided that he wanted to surpass both, but his cultivation technique interpreted the intent behind his words, and not the words literally. After all, there was a lot more to cultivation than just those two facets, and his technique began enhancing all of them. It was just that, since the changes had only just begun, and there was no opportunity yet, he had not noticed them before. With his senses strained to their utmost, he noticed the movement patterns of the soldiers just as his instincts began warning him. He saw where and how the soldiers would block him, even as his instincts began guiding him in a certain direction. Instantly, and for the first time, he realized the flaw his instincts had. Their guidance, while correct, was generic. Comparatively, when he detected all the changes himself, realized the patterns of their movement and analyzed the countermeasures himself, he reached the conclusion that the guidance of his instincts, while correct, were not the most efficient path he could take. But at the moment, Lex did not have the time to dwell on these things. The sensation of danger he was feeling was getting even stronger, and in fact he could already detect a familiar itch filling his lungs. He kept running, but before the soldiers could intercept him, he completed the technique in law effect, and teleported as far away as possible. Even while teleporting, he did not lose his momentum, and immediately crashed into the side of a hill once he reappeared. Using only 1 second, Lex reoriented himself and understood his surroundings, while he forced himself to cough until he spewed out some blood tinged with something green. But once the second was over, he continued to teleport. The feeling of danger was still strong. Back at the fort, the soldiers were alarmed by Lex's immediate disappearance. Within the fort, teleportation was supposed to be blocked, unless through the official teleportation formation. Something had definitely happened. But what they had not realized was that since the issue was not caused by Lex, but had occurred at the fort wall. When the barrel made from voidwood cracked, a green sludge had leaked out. Immediately the earth itself around the barrel began turning to ash, and ultimately the wall as well. The formation lines, which were protected by the sturdy wall, naturally were also eroded, disrupting the formation. This disruption had only taken a moment, and as it happened Lex had teleported away the very moment it happened. Yet as quick as the erosion that was taking place was, its speed was only growing as more and more barrels cracked. The green sludge continued to spread, but the effects had already begun to influence far-off places. The refugees and citizens in the fort began to collapse where they stood, one after another. The soldiers realized something was amiss, and immediately deployed their defensive techniques. Poisons and bioweapons were nothing even to the cultivation world. But it was all for naught, for their demise was only delayed by a fraction of a second. The auditor and his escort were perhaps the only ones who detected the threat at the same time as Lex, and their reaction had been exactly the same. Horrified, they teleported far away before they turned to look in the direction of the fort. "What in heaven's name was that?" asked Hennessy, though he did not let his shock slow his actions. Even before he asked, he had already activated a distress signal, and not one meant to seek help from the Jotun Empire, no. As a follower of the Henali, his distress signal targeted them directly. Jotun himself might also detect the signal, if he were in the region, but no one else. "It's Jahal liquid from the Jahal Bog realm," the auditor said with a look of disgust and fear. "It's extremely corrosive to any and every realm besides its own. If it's not contained quickly, let alone this planet, this whole star region will be affected. If things develop towards the extreme, then the energy development of the entire galaxy will be compromised." Both Ripley and Hennessy wore looks of disgust, both for very different reasons. Ripley turned and began noting something down on the document attached to his clipboard. "I'm afraid you have an eco-terrorist problem. Something like this cannot be smuggled in lightly, or by the uninformed. This is no accident. I need to report this to my manager." Before Hennessy could respond, another figure appeared in front of both of them. The figure was shrouded, so his appearance was hidden, and had no aura at all. Yet neither of them doubted the ability of whoever responded to the distress signal. "What's the problem?" he asked, his voice echoing in their minds. "We need to isolate the hazardous material on that planet and prevent its spread. We also need a follow-up team to investigate the source of this. Whatever has happened here, and how we handle the situation will be reported by Auditor Ripley to the Versailles Bank." The figure was startled at the mention of the bank and turned to look at the auditor. Suddenly the figure launched his aura in full, and overwhelmed the duo with his presence as a Tao Lord. "You had some remaining contamination on you," the figure mentioned, before disappearing. The barrels of Jaha that had exploded under the fortress, as well as countless other locations on the planet, all suddenly vanished. Although the liquid barely had a few minutes to corrode the planet, its effects were irreversible. Millions were already dead, with hundreds of millions likely to soon follow, not to mention how the environment on the planet would soon deteriorate. "Contact the local authority," the figure said to Hennessy when it reappeared. "The natives of the planet will need to be evacuated. This planet will not recover." Both Ripley and Hennessy were surprised to hear the news. It had been a few minutes, at most. Wasn't that reaction too strong? As if anticipating their curiosity, the figure continued, "The space in the region has been severely compromised. While the corrosive damage from the liquid can be fixed, the damage it did to the space around the planet can only heal naturally over time. This location has become vulnerable." As if to emphasize what the figure said, a small portal was ripped open on the planet. A horde of insect-like creatures began to pour out from the portal with no indication that they would stop any time soon. All three of them watched from a distance, since with their cultivation realm it was quite easy to notice such a significant event even from a distance. Encountering a wild minor realm with hostile creatures so soon after such an incident. "I suspect your eco-terrorists had planned this in advance. If you'll excuse me, I have to make an emergency report as per bank protocol, but I'll stay here to watch as the situation develops. Please, do not let my presence distract you from your duties." Immediately after speaking, Ripley activated a treasure which enveloped him in an opaque shield. Hennessy grimaced upon hearing such news, and activated an emergency contact device of his own. The Henali will not be pleased. The situation in the Origin realm was about to undergo a massive shake-up. Back down on the planet, Lex finally stopped teleporting as soon as instincts had suddenly stopped screaming at him. He had not been able to sense the interference of the Tao Lord despite his affinity of laws, yet he could definitely detect that the immediate danger had vanished. Yet now, a new yet familiar danger had replaced it, though this one Lex completely disregarded. He wanted to teleport right back to the inn and avoid this mess, but at the same time he did not want to abandon Alexander. He made a fist and punched himself in the gut once, causing him to vomit out some putrid, green liquid that had gathered in his stomach. Instantly, he felt a lot better, yet weaker at the same time. If whatever the hell that green stuff had affected him so severely, he did not need to imagine what had happened to the others. Chances were, Alexander himself might not have survived if he was exposed to it as well. He decided to go back to the Jotun stronghold and check it out. If the situation got worse, he could always retreat back to the inn. Chapter 725 Familiar. Although the sense of danger had vanished, Lex avoided the fort and instead took a long way around towards the Jotun stronghold. The trip would have taken him many hours had he not decided to pull out the ship he had bought to traverse the Crystal Realm. But even then his return was nowhere near quick, and yet he found Polbitby to be uncharacteristically silent. Even if he was out in the wilderness, far away from any habitation by rebel or local forces, one could usually at least hear the sounds of birds and insects, not to mention the various wild beasts. Yet now, the sound to keep Lex company was that of the wind, and literally only just the wind. Even the usual rustling of the leaves was absent, for all the leaves of any trees Lex crossed had vanished and turned to ash. The wood and bark of the trees, for some reason, remained unharmed, but it was all too easy to determine that there was no longer any life within them. The once colorful and pleasant scenery had suddenly become barren and desolate. Where once the craters caused by the war had been filled with bushes and wild grass, they were now once again empty of all but ash. It was as if the battle that had caused these craters had just ended moments ago. The eerie thing was, Lex did not even encounter any corpses. If all the wildlife had suddenly died, infected by whatever that green poison really was, there should at least be corpses lying around. Perhaps, in some way, that would have been less creepy than the sudden absence of all living creatures. Such a commute continued for a short while, but Lex, who was paying close attention for any kind of disturbance at all, suddenly detected tremors coming from his left. Due to how sensitive the situation was, Lex did not hesitate to activate his fancy contact lenses before turning his ship in the same direction. It was not easy to see far, due to the hilly terrain, but Lex soon heard the very familiar sounds of combat. From the distance he could hear the thundering of countless feet, as if from a marching army, accompanied by the frequent sound of thrashing and banging. Soon, he could hear the sound of a few explosions. He changed into his suit with ridiculously high defense and readied himself for anything as he approached the sounds of combat. His spirit senses saw the scene long before he peaked the summit of the nearest hill, revealing to him a small horde of strange gray insects. The insects were around 3 feet, (0.9 meters) long and had 2 large claws extending forward, which they used for locomotion, as they seemed to lack any other limbs dedicated for movement. The claws were also incredibly sharp and hard, which allowed them to use it for combat as well. The few thousand insects that Lex saw had surrounded a small battered group of humans who were fighting for dear life. Just as Lex readied himself to help, he finally reached the peak, which allowed him to see the battle happening below, and his face immediately distorted. Since he was not completely used to his spirit sense, he had failed to make one important distinction. The group of humans were, in fact, a group of kids, surrounded and protected by other civilians. Despite their somewhat decent cultivation realm, none beside them looked like they knew how to fight save one woman who was cutting through the insects like a storm. Lex had no hesitation as he immediately used Imperial Shield and surrounded the struggling group with a number of, shields. The insects were not too strong, with most at the Foundation realm and only a few in the Golden Core, so he was not worried at all about if they could break his barriers, and instead focused on eradicating them. Taking advantage of his height, Lex leaped forward while he used an array to summon fire around him, and fell into the horde like a meteor. The ground trembled as he fell, and the fire swept over the insects, burning them to a crisp. Yet compared to the massive horde, Lex had only removed but a single drop in the ocean. Undeterred, he cut through the horde, using his brute strength to absolutely crush anything that came in his way. The first punch he threw was slightly stiff, and had the form one could expect of someone who practiced in front of a mirror. Yet Lex seemed to gain a deeper understanding of his body, as well as the structure of the insect he punched, and immediately adapted. The second punch he threw, this time with his left hand as it was following up the one from his right, had the form and fluidity of a boxer. Moreover, although his strength did not require such precision, his punch landed at the insect's most vulnerable point, immediately crushing its spine. Lex suddenly seemed to learn something new once again, this time about how his weight distribution affected his form. Weighing at 712 pounds, 325 kilograms, it was no wonder his weight affected him. He took a step forward, as he naturally had to progress, yet somehow his posture became perfect for his third punch. This time around, it looked like the blow had been delivered by a professional fighter, and killed the insect without crushing its body. No extra strength had been used at all. As he took another step forward, he did not punch, but swept his foot around and hit countless insects that had closed up on him. When he finally threw his fourth punch, he no longer looked like a professional, but like a champion who had dominated the ring his entire career. With each step he was taking, Lex was undergoing an evolution in his understanding of combat, and his aura was undergoing a subtle change. Yet all of this was happening subconsciously, as his actual entire focus was on reaching the kids as quickly as possible. Even though they were safe, there was no need for them to remain in such an anxiety-inducing environment. As soon as he reached the barrier, he threw in a bundle of golden keys, and merely screamed "Crush them." Whether it was because of the impression he made with his arrival, descending from the heavens in a literal ball of fire, or his dominating aura, or the ruthless efficiency with which he was killing insects, no one asked any questions nor did they ponder over his motives. Without a single thought, they crushed the keys as if listening to Lex was a habit they had long since cultivated. Soon, the entire crowd disappeared, yet Lex did not fail to notice the corpses which were left behind on the ground, even within Lex's erected barriers. Many of the civilians who had been fighting the insects had bled out and died, even after Lex had separated them from the fight. Yet now was not the time to feel sentimental. He recalled there was still one real fighter, doing her best against thousands of insects, fighting for a hope of salvation that seemed too much of a fairy tale to actually believe in. He swept his spirit sense and found her shortly after. He moved towards her with urgency, not because the insects were a threat to him, no, even if he stood absolutely still it would be a wonder if they could harm him, no, he did not want another person to fall while he was still there to help, especially a woman so valiant. With ever-increasing ferocity, Lex fought against the invading Cretans and finally reached her, yet the moment he saw her a sense of familiarity hit him and he recognized who it was. Previously, when he had arrived at the fort, he had crossed paths with an unusual woman who seemed familiar to him, but he could not recognize. This solo warrior was the very same woman. But although he remembered where he saw her last, that is not why he felt like he recognized her. Instead, it was the way she fought that gave him a flashback, and momentarily halted his movements. He recalled a stage and people watching, mesmerized. He recalled gorgeous phoenix eyes, filled with energy and zeal. He recalled thin pink lips, which curved into an excited and innocent smile. He recalled a sleek jaw and smooth cheeks that looked like they were carved out of the purest marble, rather than belonging to a real human. He recalled flowing brown hair, even though a ballerina should never have openly flowing hair. Her graceful yet unique movements gave her away. She was the soldier who had once performed a ballet during the Midnight Games cultural show. Yet the reason why she seemed familiar, but Lex could not recognize her, was simply because she must have used Clark Kent glasses to hide her identity inside the inn. Yet as the owner of the inn, he had still been exposed to her real aura, which is why she felt so familiar, yet he could not recognize her. More importantly, while her alternate appearance had looked so breathtakingly beautiful, her actual appearance was, as expected, not the same at all. Now that he had uncovered why he felt like the woman was so familiar, but could not recognize her, he felt a little annoyed that the reason behind the mystery was so simple yet so stupid. "I've already teleported the group away, there's no need to continue fighting," Lex told the woman through his spirit sense. "You should hurry up and retreat as well, there's no point in continuing to fight." He also handed her a golden key, in case she didn't have one. Although there was no white horse nearby, Lex did feel like a knight in shining armor. If Fenrir were nearby, he supposed a wolf could have replaced the role of the horse. "I can't," was all she responded. Chapter 726 Teamwork Makes the Dream Work. Lex was not expecting such a response, especially in the midst of such a large crowd of monstrous insects. It was one thing for him to remain nonchalant surrounded by a few thousand blood-hungry vermin, but it was quite another case for other people. Even if he were not wearing his defensive suit, his body in itself was nothing shy of a tank, yet the ballerina before him, despite being well equipped, was not nearly in the same league. Though admittedly, her movements were phenomenal, and she had yet to suffer a single injury, it was not really enough of an excuse to ignore a safe retreat. In the midst of battle was not really an ideal time to converse, so Lex moved closer so that he could envelope both in his shields. Under normal circumstances, relocating when being assaulted from every angle was not an easy feat that one could just accomplish because he wanted to. Lex was effectively fighting against the force of a stampede when he moved through his foes, but he had enough physical strength to back him up, not to mention his ever-increasing deftness in battle. Although the situation did not really call for it, he could not help but enjoy the new sensation that he was feeling during combat. But at the same time, he could feel his improvements slowing down. There was only so much pressure this particular horde could give him, and if he wanted to continue to improve, he would need to find a bigger or stronger horde. But unlike Lex, who had all these advantages stacked up for him, the ballerina seemed to use nothing but absolute skill to allow her movement through the insect army. The flow of her movements never stopped, and each lift of the leg or wave of the hand hid a lethal intention behind it. With efficiency far greater than Lex himself, she was leaving behind insect corpses, though admittedly Lex was not really trying. Lex could not help but compare her current appearance to the one he had seen at the inn. The hair was the most prominent. Back then, it had been a deep brown, evoking nostalgic feelings such as hot chocolate during winter, the smell of pine wood, a warm crackling fire over freshly chopped logs and more. Yet now, in comparison, her fiery red hair lit his mind ablaze as if it was tinder, awaiting a lit match. The way it flowed in the air, free and wild, filled him with a feeling of excitement and energy, like he had adrenaline coursing through his veins and he needed to seize the day. Her skin had been flawless and fair, like a marble statue of a goddess. Now, however, she had freckles on her cheekbones, though admittedly they had a charm of their own, albeit quite different from the regal and distant impression she had given previously. Her phoenix eyes had been tiny and cute, yet filled with boundless excitement. Now, she had lost that feature, and had large green eyes, though somehow larger eyes suited the boundless emotions they stored. Her lips. Lex snapped himself awake from his random thoughts. Was this really the time and place to be ogling a random woman? He felt slightly embarrassed. It was not as if he had never seen a beautiful woman before. Anita, the lich that worked for him at the inn, was nothing short of breathtaking herself, breaking all stereotypes for the undead. Moreover, Zuriadissa, the four-leaf clover that had ultimately become a big shot in the Origin realm, also had a humanoid appearance that was nothing short of absolutely legendary. With a clear mind, he finally reached her and immediately put up several imperial shields around the two of them so that they could talk without interference. The abrupt emergence of a barrier disrupted the ballerina's flow for just a moment, but she recovered instantly and took a step back to analyze the situation. Upon realizing that the insects could not break the shields, she finally turned towards Lex. "Is there something else you need to do?" Lex asked, guessing the only possible reason he could think of for why someone would reject safety. "There are a couple of kids I was taking care of. I left them in the Jotun stronghold. I cannot leave without them, and if there's anywhere on this planet that's safe, it's there. Once I regroup with them, if the situation looks bad, I will consider retreating to the Midnight Inn." Although Lex did not mention the inn, upon looking at the key Lex gave her, she knew exactly where he had meant to send her. "Do you know what's happening? These insects don't look native to this planet. Don't tell me that they were unleashed to attack the rebels?" Although Lex did not want to believe that any government would use such a genocidal tactic to eliminate resistance, He knew full well the lengths that people would go to get what they wanted. What happened, we can probably only discover at the stronghold. All communication lines are down, even the emergency broadcast networks, so something pretty major happened. I don't see how the rebel or official forces could build up the courage to affect official Jotun networks. Something else must be happening. The woman paused her answer, and took a look at Lex top to bottom. A man fully suited looked incredibly out of place on the battlefield, especially when the suit remained creaseless even after a fight. He seemed strong, and though she had not paid attention to him too much, the barriers he put up were at least useful. What about you? Are you on a rescue mission, or was this something you just encountered as you passed by? There was an attack of some kind on the nearby rebel fort, and it was not something I would expect in a conflict of this scale. Something, or someone, has definitely interfered. I was also heading towards the Jotun stronghold to find out what was happening. The two did not explicitly state it, but seeing as how their objectives aligned, they seemed to reach an agreement to work together. Chapter 727, Consecutive Coincidences. My name is Lex, he introduced himself, since they were going to be working together. Giselle, she responded succinctly. Lex only nodded, and then turned to look at the endless little critters, trying to get to them. Give me a moment, Lex said, before he began forming an array. Comfortably secure behind his shields, Lex took his time to build a strong array capable of dealing area damage. The lack of pressure allowed him to comfortably pursue his repertoire of pre-made arrays, and choose the most suitable one. When he finally unleashed it, an orangish-red flame rained down from the sky, burning all the insects it touched. Among the arrays Lex had prepared, this was not the strongest, but it was one of the ones with the largest reach. He was not really interested in killing all the insects originally, and planned on leaving. But Giselle's fiery red hair reminded him of it. Not to mention that these insects could go and attack other helpless humans or any survivors of the strange green poison. It was best to get rid of as many of them as possible, so long as they did not delay him too long. Most of the Foundation realm insects burned to a crisp, though the golden core ones were only wounded. But, unfortunately for them, using an array took no energy from Lex, so as long as he was uninterrupted, he could use it as many times as he wanted. 1 wave, 2 waves, a dozen waves of flames fell from the skies until all the insects were burnt into fiery crisp, or into glowing charcoal. It only took a few minutes of his time. The reason Lex had not done this from the get-go was that he did not want to take risks with the survivors. Let's go, he said calmly, as he proceeded towards his ship. Giselle remained silent as well, giving no indication of whether she found the feat impressive or not. They set off as soon as they got in the ship. Silence fell between them. Just because Lex had focused a little more than usual on Giselle's appearance did not mean he had a crush on her, or wanted to get closer to her in any way. His focus remained on any other signs of life as they traversed the hilly terrain, yet all of it remained so barren. When all this was happening, Lex had been too busy trying to get as far away from the poison until he found a location safe enough to teleport away from. As such, although he caught glimpses of the eroding environment, he had not paid it too much mind. Giselle, on the other hand, not only had no idea of what had happened, she was completely bewildered as the environment around her started to decay. As if that was not enough, she was soon after attacked by a horde of never-before-seen insects. The day was quite eventful, to say the least. This was not even mentioning how she was suddenly feeling ill, though fortunately whatever was making her sick disappeared just as abruptly as it had arrived. A short while later, they finally crossed the border between the rebel-held area. Taking a detour around the fort took some time, but Lex was not willing to risk getting close to it. He did not believe that there were no traces of that poison left in that area. We're almost there, Lex declared, surprised that their trip had been uninterrupted by any other significant event. It seemed like they truly were traveling on a barren planet. Although there weren't so many people around when I crossed last time, it really wasn't this empty. I suppose everyone retreated to the stronghold, said Lex absently, not really expecting a response. A lot of people died very suddenly, and whoever died turned to ash, leaving no trace of their bodies. The same happened to all the beasts. What? Lex asked, startled. Before Giselle could clarify what she meant, a few things distracted him. First, Mary reached out to him. Lex, I thought you should know, a group of kids and civilians arrived at the inn a short while ago. They were all wounded and so were being treated, but we've just discovered an extremely potent poison in their bodies. Even the recovery pod cannot heal them, and will at most slow things down. If nothing is done, they're going to die. The news was quite alarming, as it meant even people who had survived the initial spread of the poison may end up dying. But before Lex could process the news, or even check up on his new companion, he felt a strange fluctuation in space. Overhead, a tear opened up in space itself, and insects began raining down from the sky. Only, these ones weren't as weak as the ones Lex encountered before. The weakest ones were at the Golden Core realm, while a majority were at the Nascent realm. Based on this trend, there was even a chance for there to be some immortals. If there are immortals, we won't be able to cross so easily. Be ready to retreat to the inn, Lex said seriously, his gaze fixed on the insect rain. No, I can't afford to leave the kids behind. If the situation gets bad, you can leave without me. I'll find my way across. Lex snapped his neck back to look at her and see whether she was serious or not. He did not know if she was being stubborn, or really had something to rely on. Either way, for now at least, it seemed like he had to force his way through. And we were so close. He couldn't help but mumble. One could even say that he had raised this flag himself by acknowledging how easy his journey had been, but Lex thoroughly refused to believe in flags. He would continue this behavior and prove that the continuous bouts of bad luck he encountered were all just consecutive coincidences. Chapter 728, No Fear. As inconvenient as it was having to go through a rain of killer insects, Lex was not only going because of Giselle. He needed a cure for the poison if he was going to treat his guests, and the Jotun Empire was the most likely to have one. Or at least know of one. This was completely not an excuse for him to show off in front of a pretty girl. You keep mentioning wanting to retreat. If you wish to head back, you can go. I can manage on my own, said Giselle. She had been using the ride to recuperate and had recovered much of her spiritual energy. This was a completely foreign concept to Lex, as he always had such massive spiritual energy reserves that he barely ever came close to depletion. If he ever did, it was mostly because of how ridiculously extreme his situation was. It's not me I'm worried about. I am well aware of what I can handle, but typically, going straight through thousands of enemies is reason enough to give others pause. He looked at her to see if she reacted, but her gaze was completely fixed on her objective. Lex's mention of the number of enemies did not faze her at all. I can take care of myself. I am no stranger to a tough fight. She paused for a moment, then turned to look at Lex. As you said, facing so many enemies is no cakewalk. Is there a particular reason why you're heading to the stronghold? If it's just curiosity about what happened, you can always find out after the fight is over. A strange poison was spread across Polbitvy. It even affected those that I rescued. I'm hoping the Jotun have the cure for it. After all, someone definitely acted out to stop the spread, or the damage caused would have been much worse. As soon as he finished speaking, Lex's expression changed as he realized something. Wait a minute, are you also poisoned? He asked, although he believed he already had an answer. Both times when it came to the matter of the poison, even he was affected, so how could others avoid it? All the more reason to reach the stronghold, Giselle said calmly, as if her words were explanation enough. Lex shook his head disapprovingly. Exertion would most likely only make her situation worse, but if she wasn't willing to listen to reason, who was he to force her otherwise? He, instead, turned his attention forward. The stronghold, by which he meant the small area protected by the Jotun Empire, was not yet in view, but it was close. We cannot let them slow us down, declared Lex as his ship continued to move towards the raining insects. For a moment, he could not help thinking that he was glad that he didn't have entomophobia. I'm strongest at close-range combat, though I can still do some damage at a distance. My shields don't really work well with a moving object, so they're out of the picture. As it happens, what I'm best at is also close-range combat, but well, I'm sure I can manage something. Giselle nodded and summoned a vial from a spatial equipment she had, before drinking it. Clearly she was making preparations for the fight. Lex, too, decided to prepare for the fight, so he entered his state of flow. When he told her that what he was best at was close-range combat, it wasn't wrong since he only recently improved dramatically in the field. But even so, that didn't mean he was lacking in other areas. He did not know why, but his instincts warned that it was best he keep his identity hidden while fighting, so he used notorious anonymity, the technique that covered his face with a particularly devilish mask. Giselle suddenly got goosebumps and looked towards Lex. For some reason, the aura he was giving out changed, and quite dramatically. Two arrays appeared around him, one in front of each hand, and his eyes hidden behind the mask became dark. Without regal embrace holding him back, it was time to let loose and see what he could really do. While Lex only had to face a newly forming horde, and even then he only had to cross them rather than defeat them all, the situation in the Jotun stronghold was much, much worse. 5 separate tiers in space surrounded the stronghold, unleashing 5 massive armies of the very same insects. A massive formation protected the stronghold from the immediate threat of the horde, but it was unknown how long the formation would hold out, for 5 immortal insects were constantly bashing it. The stronghold did not have many soldiers, but the few that were stationed there were all geared up and standing ready for their orders. Even facing such a tremendous force, there was not a hint of fear that tainted their resolve. If anything, a sense of excitement and anticipation filled every street and corner. To become a Jotun soldier was not something that could be achieved by the faint of heart. Or rather, the Jotun took those weak of heart and turned them into spectacular soldiers. The number of insects had grown so immense that no one could guess how many there truly were. They could not climb the formation, but so many of them piled up against it that they at first began to cover the sides. But slowly and steadily, as their numbers increased, they began to truly cover the entire formation, slowly and steadily blocking all the light that was entering within. It was this scene and this environment into which Alexander stepped when he was finally released from his interrogations. Behind him 6 blades floated, now with the very edge of their blade glowing red. After fighting Lex last time, he had thought of ways to increase his attacking power, and this new technique was what he came up with. Within the center building of the stronghold, Belle, who was going by the codename Valkyrie, received an emergency call. It was her ancestor, and the founder of the Williams family. Chapter 729 Bloody Art. Ancestor what dash? Don't speak and just listen to me, William interrupted Belle, his mood extremely solemn. The situation at Polbitby is extremely dire. Not just the entire planet, but the entire star system, as well as all star systems nearby, are being evacuated. In fact, the Empire may even give up on the entire Pendal galaxy, depending on what happens next. What I'm about to tell you is beyond confidential, to the utmost degree, and is perhaps the most important news you will hear in your entire life. William paused, though only for the briefest of moments, giving Belle enough time to process everything he had just said. The news I'm giving you is the same news I would give to any of my descendants if they were in your situation, understand? What you're about to hear is not a reward for your talent or your newfound strength, it's an opportunity independent of everything else. Whether you take it or not is up to you, and whether you survive or not is also completely up to chance. William's exasperation and frustration as he said those words was quite evident, but she could not understand why. What she did understand was that she was in a situation much more serious than she had ever faced before, and perhaps it was not the time to be willful. Of course, that would never prevent her from being willful if she truly wanted to. She could not control the universe, that was something she learned at a very early age. She could only control her own actions. Jeffrey, the terrorist you were hunting, seems to have a much bigger background than anyone expected or anticipated. What he just pulled off at Polbitby has interrupted plans that are billions of years in the making, and he has angered some tremendously powerful people. As we speak, almost every single powerful entity in the entire Origin realm is surely making their way to the Pendau galaxy to hunt for his traces. What you have is an advantage everyone else lacks, which is that you're the closest to him. If you can hunt him down, whether you catch him alive or kill him, the rewards you will get surpass anything you can imagine. I'm forwarding you a live link to the same information the Emperor himself is receiving at this very moment. What you do next is completely up to you. The call ended, and the world around Bell seemed to slow down. Although a lot of extremely critical information was shared, due to their cultivation, their speed of communicating was extremely fast. Not even a complete second had passed since she picked up the call, and it had already ended. Countless thoughts swam through her head. Her personal goals, her family's struggles, the grudges against her parents she had nursed in her heart for so many years, the fates of the soldiers under her command, the fate of her two sisters, Liz who had run away and had yet to be found, and Moon who had spent most of her life imprisoned, her brother Lex who vanished off Earth with no trace, and countless others. With this opportunity in front of her, she felt like her character was truly being tested. After all, right at her doorstep 5 immortals were banging, waiting to come in and kill them all. Moreover, there was only one immortal stationed in the Jotun stronghold. Without Bell's help, he probably would not survive long against 5 foes. That meant everyone at the stronghold would similarly die. She closed her eyes and sighed. Since when had she cared about others? She would do whatever she wanted, as she had always done. A bright light burst out of her skin, passing through all walls and obstructions, and her aura began to rise. Giselle slowly lowered the sword in her hand. It seemed that she would not need it, at least for now. Her eyes were fixed on Lex, who stood at the bow of the ship, his feet planted firmly and his posture perfect. He did not seem to be fighting a dire fight, but instead orchestrating a grand work of art. A very bloody and brutal piece of art. The arrays he used summoned countless small spikes of ice, barely as large as her finger, and that's it. The arrays did not even launch the spikes. No, Lex did that personally using his spirit sense. At first a couple, then a few, then a dozen, and then a few dozen, until it reached the point where she could no longer count. Insects swarmed them to attack. Yet each insect that came close was pierced with a single ice spike, and fell to the ground. Not all insects died. Some were only crippled, while others were merely paralyzed, while others still, those who were stronger, were merely wounded seriously. He was extremely accurate in his aim, and precise in targeting only those that targeted them first. She did not know how long he could keep this up, but in her mind that was much too powerful. No one at the Golden Core realm should be this good at killing, yet when she thought about it, all he really did was use some arrays and his spirit sense. Theoretically speaking, it shouldn't even be very spirit energy intensive. Was this a display of not being good at long-range fighting? Once, a nascent level insect seemed to have blocked the spikes and came close to attacking them. Giselle prepared to counter so that Lex could continue fighting the rest, but then Lex merely looked towards the insects, and it began screaming as if its very soul had been ripped to shreds. In a few minutes, they passed through the insect rain and came out the other side. The experience was completely surreal, and Giselle kept looking back as if to ensure they really had managed to cross so easily. But just as she was beginning to feel the relief of a close escape, Lex cursed. Crap. Chapter 730: A Devil and an Angel. Crossing the new space breach was relatively simple, as the insects had not had time to accumulate. At most, it was like crossing a thick, heavy curtain if that curtain were made of living, smelly, disgusting insects that smelled. Lex wiped off some bloody goo from under his nose. No wonder the smell kept haunting him. It was still dangerous and tricky, but manageable more or less due to how fast his ship was. Yet when he looked at the stronghold after crossing the curtain, Lex could not help but curse. There were too many insects to count, and they were beginning to cover the dome like protective formation around it, slowly covering the entire stronghold. As if that was not enough, he could feel the familiar yet intimidating aura of immortals from the insects. That's not good, even Giselle admitted with a frown as she noticed the siege. Despite the situation, Lex could not help but be a bit amused. Really? The army blocking our way is bad news? But he had the sense to not voice out his thoughts. Giselle, do you know anything about a raise? Lex asked, as he thought up a plan of what to do next. The most important thing was to avoid the immortals. Everything else could be managed. Just the basics. I can't use a raise if that's what you mean. No, not that, Lex said. A raise, no matter how big or small, how strong or weak, are all powered by the universe. They get their energy from their environment. But the issue I'm facing is that the energy here is really weak and unstable. My arrays are coming out a lot weaker than they're supposed to be. Giselle raised an eyebrow. That was weak? The reason I'm telling you this is because what I'm about to do next is really risky. Even if you really don't want to, I suggest you mentally prepare yourself to retreat to the inn. What are you planning? Lex only smiled weakly, but did not answer. Some things were best not said aloud, lest he be accused of being crazy. In that moment, the aura of another immortal appeared, and this time behind them. It seemed like an immortal insect really had emerged from that hole in space. Guess there was no more time to look back. The stronghold was becoming ever darker as the soldiers waited for their orders. For now, all the combat was being done via the formation, so they need not do anything. But the moment the formation failed or was deactivated, it would be their turn to fight. Alexander could not help but crane his neck upward, as he looked at the remaining bit of the formation still uncovered, and at the last few rays of light still coming in. He had already sent a message to the inn to inform Lex not to come back to Pulbetvy, at least for now. The result of the upcoming battle would determine whether Alexander would even continue hunting for the terrorists or not. Yet just as the dome was about to completely darken, a pure, bright light emerged from the center of the stronghold, illuminating every corner. Alexander could not help but turn back to see where the light was coming from. At first, he could not see much as the source of the light was too bright, causing him to close his eyes. But a few moments later, though the light did not dim, a figure suddenly became visible right in the center. All anyone could see was a vague outline of a woman, and 6 incredible, massive wings coming out from behind her. She was rising up in the air slowly, and her aura grew more powerful as she rose higher. One could tell that she was building up her strength to release it all at once. But before she had a chance to reach her peak strength, the sound of thunder pierced the dome, the very ground trembling from its reverberating might. The soldiers once again snapped their neck, this time towards the source of the sound. At the base of the dome, they could see that the insects had been burnt to a crisp, and a clearing, ever so small, appeared. But the clearing was too small, and the horde was quickly coming to close it. But before they could, a bolt of lightning fell from the sky, once again devastating any insects near that clearing, and releasing another thunderous roar. For some reason, all the soldiers had the same thought: tribulation lightning. But, why was it striking the ground here? Was the planet itself undergoing a tribulation? But before their minds could wander much farther, and their imagination ran wild, a figure became visible from the clearing. On a strange ship in the shape of a canoe, a man and a woman were quickly approaching. Even from such a distance, the devilish mask covering the man's face was visible, though the soldiers did not have time to appraise it for long. A mind-rattling shriek pierced the air, and an insect struck out at them from a distance. The insect looked identical to any other, but the aura of an immortal was all too prominent to make anyone mistake it for an ordinary one. They could only watch helplessly as the daring raid from the 2 stragglers was about to fail, but then something unexpected happened. The devil lifted its hand and, with perfect timing, seemed to divert the attack just as it was about to hit them, and launched it towards the clearing. There was another thunderous roar, and this time all the insects in the path of the canoe were shredded, forming a gruesome red carpet of blood for the passage of the ship. In that very instant, the figure in the center of light reached her peak strength, and unleashed a devastating attack that seemed to target each and every insect around the dome. For better or worse, the battle had begun. On one side was a man akin to a devil, on another side a woman who radiated the aura of an angel, and in the middle a horde of wailing insects. Chapter 731, Stop Showing Off. Back when the AI had invaded the inn, Lex had taken an attack from an immortal head-on, and survived. It was an experience he was not eager to repeat, for every bone in his body had been crushed almost into fine powder. Moreover, the only reason he survived was because the robot had lacked something fundamental that other immortals had, which made it weaker. So, although Lex of course needed recognition for the event, one could also say a lot of luck was at play. If the robot had not been fundamentally weaker, if the force of the attack had not been channeled into the ground through his feet, and if Impervious Hand had somehow not taken control of the robot's soul, there was a good chance Lex would have died, or at least been seriously injured beyond what he had been already. That was why Lex did not dare utter out his plan to once again face an immortal, lest his resolution waver. But, unlike last time, Lex did not intend to take the attack head-on. No, this time, Lex only wanted to divert the attack into the otherwise massive army of insects to clear a path for his escape into the formation. That should be easy, right? He only needed to accomplish 2 impossible feats, back to back. Lex entered the flow state, getting rid of any distracting thoughts and allowing himself to focus on the task at hand. He honed in on any guidance his instincts provided, while at the same time started using all the new advantages he had gained with his new cultivation technique. He used a familiar array, and summoned the lightning from immortal tribulations to herald his arrival, and attract the attention of an immortal. If he was going to do this, he absolutely could not allow himself to cower or do things half-heartedly. Even a hint of weakness, even if it was in his thoughts, or the aura he had accumulated, could result in his failure. Therefore, he had to act as if he already knew he was bound to succeed. No, he could not act. His success was a foregone conclusion, he just had to act it out now. There were no clouds in the sky until Lex used his array, or rather, until he repeatedly used the same array. Although his arrays were not delivering the same level of attacks he was used to, he would just go for quantity if he failed in quality. Like divine judgment, lightning slammed down on the ground, destroying everything in its path. The insects were decimated, and those that were lucky enough to survive the first lightning strike were done in by the second, or the third, or even the fourth. Behind Lex, Giselle stood with a sword in her hand, a stoic expression on her face. There weren't any good solutions, so they had to go for a bad solution. Since Lex seemed decently confident, she allowed him to lead. Secretly though, she retrieved a small blue orb and clenched it in the fist of her free hand. As lightning fell, as the earth shook, as the insects wailed, and even as an immortal insect attacked, she did not flinch. If Lex could not handle the situation, she would. But the orb in her fist remained unused. As the attack descended on them, Lex, with such perfect timing it seemed like he had practiced it 100 times, reached out with his right hand and, ever so carefully, diverted it to the insects in their path. He had done it so smoothly it seemed like he barely used any effort, and with the devilish mask hiding his expressions, one could not tell if he was even in any pain, for the mask seemed to be laughing. Lex kept standing, but the ship they were on seemed to have suffered greatly from just being in the proximity of the attack. It began to slow, and eventually began to fall. "Follow me," Lex said in a seemingly calm voice. He stepped onto the bow of the ship and then took another step forward, landing perfectly on the ground as the ship itself crashed into the ground. Giselle, too, had exited the ship calmly, and continued to walk behind Lex. Though, at the speed they were moving at, walking only referred to how casually they moved their legs, not the distance they were covering. In a few seconds they crossed the macabre red carpet that marked their path and reached the formation. Just as there was hope that they could enter the formation without the need for any fighting, a devastating attack was launched from within the stronghold. Instantly the nature of the formation changed, and instead of blocking the insects it allowed them to enter, so that the soldiers could fight in a terrain that suited them rather than the enemy. Amidst the roar of the soldiers' battle cry, and the wailing of a sea of insects, Giselle could have sworn she heard Lex sigh. Gently, Lex tucked his right hand into his trouser pocket and lifted his left hand. "Shall we see whose close combat is better?" he asked, casually, as if standing in his own backyard. Giselle rolled her eyes and lifted her sword. If you're injured, just follow my lead. No need to try and show off, she said, before beginning her ballet performance. A few thousand tons of insects were falling on top of them now that the formation had changed, and there was no more time for talking. Yet even then, for some reason, she could clearly hear the sound of Lex chuckling. Injured? Oh, Lex was most definitely injured as his right hand, arm, shoulder blade, and rib cage were crushed. The muscles in that half of his body were also shredded. If someone poked Lex on his right side at that moment, they would discover that his body was more like jelly than its usual self. It was in anticipation of such a level of injury that Lex had blocked from his right instead of his left, lest his heart be crushed as well. It was not the injury itself that was the problem for Lex at that moment, as he could control his body using just his spirit energy. No, it was the soul-ripping pain that he was in that was overwhelming his senses. The reason he had so calmly descended from the ship, the reason he so casually walked to the dome formation, and the reason he was doing everything with such serenity was not because he wanted to look cool, but because sudden jerks shot pain all through his body. Chapter 732 Fresh from the fight. The first thing Lex did was to erect an imperial shield above himself and Giselle. No matter how strong they were, being crushed by the enormous weight of a mountain of insects was going to kill them. The next thing he did was analyze the situation. He had not expected the formation to change so suddenly. He was betting on getting inside the formation since he was sure that it would only block out the insects, not the humans. Or else, he would remain at the mercy of the immortal level insect. Though he had diverted one of its attacks, he could not do so again. As it was, the immortal level insect no longer focused on him for a devastating attack from within the formation had targeted all the immortal level insects. What followed was a fight among immortals, held up in the air above the stronghold. Lex did not doubt that the Empire would come out the winner in the competition, as the strength of the Empire was not for show. For all the bravado he had shown earlier, Lex now only had one objective: to reach the center of the stronghold. He would get away from the fighting, and see if there was a cure to the poison to be found. If not, he would get out of there as quickly as possible and go get some sleep. The serious injury he had suffered was no doubt going to end with him sleeping for at least another month or two, which would seriously hamper his plans. But his plans couldn't keep up reality. He could now only hope that whatever treasure the mystery man wanted him to find had not yet been discovered. Unfortunately for Lex, even in his current situation, his plans couldn't keep up with reality. Just as he started heading deeper into the stronghold to get away from the battle, Bel informed the Jotun immortal stationed there to hold nothing back and attack with all his strength and resources. Just above her head was an opportunity so precious, beings from all over the realm were rushing towards her. Every second she wasted was a second's worth of advantage she gave up. Orders passed down in a flash, and the Jotun forces finally charged. Though it was a uniform charge, with all forces working in tandem, their speed was not slow at all. Instantly the two forces clashed, and all hell was let loose. Lex and Giselle were completely surrounded by insects, and as if the pressure they were facing was not enough, the charge by the Jotun forces pushed the insects back, effectively squeezing the two who were caught in the middle. Lex, who had used Harden to ensure the right side of his body didn't slump, was not really in the state to respond quickly to the oncoming force. Since his arrays, albeit not useless, were not delivering the potency he had come to expect, he had to get creative. His right hand still in his pocket, Lex lifted his left hand and held out his palm, as if asking the insects to stop. But naturally, Lex was not being so courteous. Instead, he was making use of his extremely alien space affinity. He had not yet learned to harness its power in any tangible way, unlike his employee Z, but during his brief and rare instances of practice, the one thing he had learned was what kind of use would bring about undesirable results. Right now, that's exactly what he wanted. The air in front of his palm started to wrinkle, just a bit, and all the insects who came in the vicinity of the wrinkles slowed down, as if the flow of time itself had altered around them. But that was not the case. Instead, the already fragile space in Pulbitvi had become warped. In some places it had become denser, and others it had stretched beyond what was reasonable. The insects who entered this region experienced the unpleasantness, which was having the very space their bodies occupied become fragile. The instability of space did not hurt their physical bodies nearly as much as it tortured their souls, which required absolute stability to exist. Although Lex had, in one single move, stopped the retreat of the entire army, he instantly paled as he felt his energy reserve deplete drastically. No matter his affinity, playing with space, especially on such a large scale, was not easily sustained. Lex withdrew his left arm as he mentally prepared himself for a real fight close up. Though he still planned on continuing to use arrays, their current unreliability meant that at any time he might need to defend himself. Even though it was bound to hurt, if it came down to it, he'd fight tooth and nail. But, just as he mentally prepared himself to face some pain, he felt a connection that had eluded him for a long time, and he could not help but relax. With his space interference stopped, the few hundred insects which had been affected fell to the ground, but the countless vermin behind them did not pause and rushed towards him like a tidal wave. Giselle, who had been fighting off the attack from the opposite side, sensed the arrival and prepared herself to rescue Lex, but then suddenly he seemed to vanish in her senses. Alarmed, she turned to look back, but was not prepared for what she saw. Although he could not be detected, Lex had not vanished. Instead, he was now astride a massive, white wolf, which similarly could not be detected by her senses. "Get on," she heard him speak through his spirit sense, and she did not hesitate to comply. Fenrir, who had just ended an extremely long and difficult trial, was ready to meet its friends it had not seen in so long. Yet what awaited it was not the familiar cozy and comfy midnight inn, but a brutal battlefield. Strong, fast, and fresh from a fight for the fate of the forest, Fenrir had arrived just in time to save Lex from an uncomfortable amount of pain. "I'm a little hurt," confided Lex to his trusted companion. "I'll let you deal with this rabble." Chapter 733 Odd Encounter. Atop his loyal steed, atop his loyal wolf, Lex was suddenly reminded of the fact that even in his most desperate situation, he really wasn't alone. The nefarious system added all kinds of restrictions to prevent his escape to the inn during a fight, but there was no such restriction on bringing in members of the inn. The moment he felt his connection to Fenrir restored, he did not hesitate to summon him over. Lex could instantly tell that Fenrir had grown much stronger, and from him Lex could feel an aura that was oddly similar to divine energy, though not quite. The pup was momentarily startled by its sudden arrival in a battlefield, but it did not affect its performance. It had been fighting non-stop until its trial ended, and so it had really honed its instincts. Although a battlefield was a very different environment to fight in from a forest, the pup adapted quickly enough. With the ferocity that befitted one who had been originally summoned as a protector for the inn, the pup tore through the horde as if it was paper. Whether it was one insect in front of it or 100, its claws felt no difference. Giselle was genuinely surprised now, and finally a tinge of curiosity awoke within her. Deflecting the blow of an immortal did not make as much of an impression on her as Fenrir did, as she was deeply knowledgeable about beasts, and could tell that Fenrir's origins weren't simple. Lex, who did not doubt Fenrir's capability at all, was not paying attention to it at all. Instead, all his spirit sense had converged within his body, more specifically his back, as he tried to communicate with the lotus on his back. It had been oddly silent for a while now, which suited Lex fine most of the time. But now, he needed its help. Originally, Lex never dared to ask the lotus for things like this, because he was always too worried about maintaining the prestige of the innkeeper. But now that he was slowly and steadily becoming more powerful, he was a lot less concerned about that, at least as far as the lotus was concerned. With time, as he grew stronger, he would have to pretend less and less, as he would eventually completely come into the role of the innkeeper, and perhaps even surpass it one day. With such a mentality, he did not shy from making use of the lotus when he could. "Hey, wake up," he transmitted his voice into the tattoo on his back. The lotus did not immediately respond, so Lex gathered up his energy and focused, doing his best to summon the authority and aura of the innkeeper he had nurtured on his own, not the one given to him by the host attire. Fenrir, Giselle, and all the immortals in the vicinity noticed the unusual aura gathering down below, but none other than the first two could tell where it was coming from. "Wake up," his voice echoed, and this time, the lotus roused from its deep slumber. "My body is injured," Lex said, his tone unchanging. "Do you think you can speed up its recovery?" "Yes, of course," the baby lotus responded timidly, and immediately began channeling its aura and circulating around Lex's body, drastically speeding up his recovery. "Is this kind of thing a burden for you?" Lex asked again, just to be sure. "No, not really. But I can't spend much time awake. I have already used up a lot of my energy without getting enough rest. If I keep this up, it'll be really bad for my growth." "I understand," Lex said as he felt his body recover. He decided not to bother the lotus unless it was a real emergency in the future. But with so many allies around him, Lex's confidence grew once again. Despite how casually Lex was taking it, the battle was actually extremely intense. Too much time had passed already, and Belle decided to end things once and for all, even if she had to pay a price. The 6 illusory wings, behind her spread, glowing with light so bright it blinded the eyes and spirit sense of all in the area. When the light receded, it took the shape of an armor and sword made entirely of light. Her helmet of light did not even leave any gaps for her eyes, though at her level such things hardly mattered. When the remaining insects caught sight of her again, she had already critically wounded one immortal, and swiftly moved to injure another. Alarmed, the insects began working together, not harming her but keeping themselves from harm as well. Feeling frustrated, she held back no more and activated her tenets, which began affecting the environment around them, and made the situation even more dangerous. The entire continent under her suffered an earthquake, and the fighting on the ground stopped momentarily, and the scenery in the sky changed. As if alarmed by the sudden change, all the immortal insects suddenly focused all their attacks on the shining angel in the sky, Belle. Though she could have avoided it, she allowed herself to be hit as she gathered her strength. Their attacks could not penetrate her armor anyway. Like a comet, she crashed into the ground, killing countless insects. Yet that brief departure from battle also gave her the time she needed to prepare her final attack. She looked up, ready to hone in on her targets, but saw a white wolf standing above her, looking down at her oddly. Atop the wolf sat a man wearing a devilish mask and a woman, also looking down at her. While her aura should have prevented anyone not immortal from even approaching her, these few all seemed unaffected. The wolf, as if deciding it was uninterested, turned away and continued to fight the insect horde. Belle, due to her excellent senses, heard the devilish man mumble, "I should really get a pair of sunglasses," while squinting away from the light her body was emitting. The odd encounter did not even give her a moment's pause. She had no time to wait, and finally, her full strength was unveiled. Her Valkyrie soul was awakened, and she, as a human, channeled the racial powers of the angels. She unleashed an attack so bright, for a moment the light from the local star even seemed to dim in comparison, before flying off into the sky. She never meant to kill the insects anyway. Injuring them was more than enough to hold them off until reinforcements arrived. Chapter 734 ACA Lex. It took Lex a few moments to realize what happened. The Earth Immortal with angel wings had launched a devastating attack that heavily influenced the battle in the humans' favor, before disappearing into space. Although her target had been other immortal insects, the collateral damage from her attacks drastically dropped the number of enemies the humans had to fight. It made life easier for Lex, too. With fewer obstructions, Fenrir quickly navigated his way from the very thick of battle towards the center of the stronghold. With the army's well-trained coordination, it was only a matter of time before they won the war outright. With the pressure off him, Lex easily soon exited the battle, though no one seemed to notice the giant wolf as it openly marched through the vacant streets. "You're leaving the battle?" Giselle questioned, a hint of disapproval in her voice. "Certain matters require urgent attention," Lex replied, paying her no mind. He had officially brought her to the stronghold, and even helped her escape the fight. If she wished to go back, he would not stop her nor interfere in her matters. His focus was entirely on the cure. Giselle hesitated, but decided to stick with him. Lex was right. Her priority in the current situation was to check on the kids who had been with her, not the fight. Lex was beginning to feel that the worst was behind him, when suddenly Giselle coughed. It was not a bad cough, and it did not happen again, but at their level, even a cough was a significant matter. He was suddenly reminded that she was poisoned, as possibly everyone else in the area as well. Lex and Giselle looked at each, both aware of what the cough meant. "Let me see if I can slow down the poison," Lex said as he lifted his hand, but waited for her to agree. Considering that Lex's performance was quite remarkable so far, and that he himself had yet to show any signs of suffering from the poison, she nodded. Lex placed his fingers right below her wrist, as if checking her pulse. But he was not investigating her situation. Instead, he asked the lotus, "Can you check the body of the woman I'm touching? Can you find a cure for the poison in her system?" "Let me check," the lotus said, and allowed its energy to travel through Lex's fingers into Giselle's wrist. Giselle, who was being investigated, suddenly stiffened. The spiritual energy which had entered her wrist was beyond overbearing. If she tried to resist in any way, there was a very good chance her meridians themselves might tear. After a few moments of investigation, the lotus replied, "Yes, I can remove the poison, but this poison is incredibly powerful. I'm afraid the moment I finish removing it, I'll fall into a deep sleep." Lex frowned, and then removed his hand. This was the first time he had encountered something that gave the lotus some kind of trouble. Whatever the poison's origins were, they absolutely weren't ordinary. For now, it wasn't worth putting the lotus to sleep to save one person. Although he said nothing, the frown on his face informed Giselle of whatever she needed to know. She wasn't particularly disappointed, for she didn't expect much. If the poison were so easy to remove, she would have already done it. Little did she know, Lex really had removed the poison from his own body. Although technically, that was a result of his body's own reaction, and was achieved by removing the infected area, such as a piece of his lung or his blood. "Let's hurry," was all Lex could offer as he spurred Fenrir to pick up the pace. It had to be mentioned that the poison remained unidentified even by the fancy contact lenses, and the same could be said for the strange insects. Lex could accept the absence of information of the poison due to how unusual it was, but considering the lenses came from the Emporium, he expected them to have a detailed database of all common and uncommon creatures in the origin realm at least. This point was highly suspicious, but Lex could do nothing about it, so he put the matter at the back of his mind. "I'll get off here, the apartment I left the kids in is in a different direction," said Giselle as she hopped off Fenrir. "Good luck," offered Lex, before he continued on his way. He was not roaming the stronghold randomly, and was heading towards the main command center in which they even had their teleportation formations. If he wanted to ask about the poison, he would either need to find a doctor, or someone higher up along the chain of command. The building, surprisingly, was not unprotected as Lex had expected. There was a heavily armed guard stationed at every corner. At a glance Lex could easily determine that these were not the usual guards, but instead were probably some of the reinforcements that had teleported over. He didn't know what they were waiting for, but he knew that if he revealed himself they'd probably ask him to reveal his identity. Fortunately, Lex had an official identity with the Jotun forces. He asked Fenrir to shrink down as they hid beside a nearby building, and Lex dismissed notorious anonymity. He even changed out of his suit so that no one would associate him with the crazy devil guy who had diverted an immortal's attack. Giselle was the only one who knew his identity, but he did not really expect her to tattle. Even if she did, he was not too concerned, for the nagging feeling his instincts gave him to hide his identity had vanished. So much movement caused his pain to once again spike, but there was nothing he could do about that. At least the lotus was healing him, which helped reduce the pain somewhat. As soon as he neared the main building, the stationed guards noticed him and aimed their weapons at him. "Identify yourself," one of the soldiers yelled in an extremely aggressive and hostile voice. "Auxiliary Combat Aid, ACA, Lex," he yelled back, as he walked back slightly hunched. "I'm severely injured, I need medical aid." The guards finally lowered their weapons and approached Lex, but even then, no one seemed to notice the little white pup following behind Lex. Fenrir's abilities had really grown during his time away. Chapter 735, Mysterious Healer. Two soldiers slowly approached Lex to ensure he had nothing suspicious planned. Although they knew the ongoing battle was against some foreign race, they were under the highest level lockdown, so they had to take every precaution. "What's the matter with you? You don't look injured," said one of the soldiers. "It's the bones in my right arm. They're completely crushed." "I need to see a doctor," confessed Lex, telling the truth. This was a much quicker way of getting close to the medical professionals than showing up and directly asking for the cure. Besides, he was not sure if more immortals would be showing up. If that were the case, using any kind of coercive means would end badly for him. Not to mention, if he got to experience the medical system of the Empire firsthand and liked it, there was a lot he could learn. The soldier scanned Lex with his spirit sense, and was alarmed to see the state Lex was in when he checked his body. Naturally, Lex allowed the scan, otherwise his state would remain undetectable from the outside. "My God, how are you standing?" the soldier asked in shock, and immediately cleared the way for Lex. It was not long before a floating gurney was brought for Lex to lay down on, and he was quickly brought inside, little Fenrir following them the entire way. Lex had not yet had time to question the pup about its new abilities, but he was thoroughly impressed by the little he had seen. He remembered that while the pup had always had an advantage in stealth, previously it would still have to stay out of sight to keep that stealth active. Now, the pup was prancing about in plain sight, and all were ignoring him. During the fight earlier, he had used this to his advantage to wreak havoc among the insects, all without getting targeted even once, as none of the insects could detect him at all. Pretty soon, Lex was brought into an overcrowded room that looked like it had previously been an office, and was now being used as an emergency room. Makeshift beds produced by joining two small tables together, multiple 4 drips, and overwhelmed medical personnel could be seen everywhere. Lex was brought to a doctor as well, but after scanning Lex once, he was designated as a non-emergency case and was only given a single painkiller and moved to the side of the room. The outfit was clearly understaffed as soldiers were running about, using their emergency first aid training to follow the instruction of a few doctors. The room was not filled with wounded soldiers, but countless civilians who all seemed to be suffering the effects of the poisoning. In such a chaotic situation, no one noticed Lex's spirit sense, which subtly moved about the room and closely listened in on the conversation of various doctors. He was trying to figure out if they had any cure from their conversations, but that was easier said than done, as they only seemed to be giving out orders for how to handle their patients. His instincts weren't particularly helpful at the moment either, so all he could do was wait. Fenrir too was exploring the place in secret, though Lex did not know what to expect from the pup. With the battle outside all but taken care of, Lex had enough time to spare until he found out about the state of things. Moreover, now that he was within the main office, he was aware that a stream of reinforcements were constantly teleporting over. It could not be said that everything was going great, but it was going well enough. Until it suddenly wasn't. Lex frowned when his instincts began warning him of impending danger, and sure enough, soon Lex saw a panicked soldier run through the halls. He found a superior and whispered something in his ears, but Lex heard what was said. The soldiers who had been affected by the poison were able to hold it off using some of the best medicine the Empire could supply, but the strain of combat increased their metabolism, which aggravated the poison's effects. Soldiers had started to faint in the midst of combat. This was suddenly going from a sure victory to an impending disaster. It was also at that point that Lex found out the state of the poison's cure. There was none. The Empire had no idea what the poison actually was, although apparently someone who could, through some unusual means, delay the effects of the poison had been discovered. Despite the critical situation, due to the Empire's phenomenal training, the soldiers did not fall into too much confusion. With a clear chain of command, someone took over and began giving out orders. Lex, who was being completely ignored, decided to stop delaying matters. He called back Fenrir, and used the pup's abilities to suddenly vanish from sight as he moved towards the mysterious healer that had been discovered. Anytime something inexplicable happened, Lex thought of systems, so he had to investigate this healer no matter what. Shortly after, Lex followed the soldier outside the building and to a nearby park where hundreds of civilians were lying on beds of leaves. A bunch of kids were running around obeying orders, and in the middle of the park standing atop a monument was a young, fair man wearing a doctor's white coat. The doctor was extremely skinny and seemed like he would be blown over by a single breeze, yet at the same time he exuded an aura of confidence and stability. Lex could not help it, and tried to use his targeted scan. Name, Charles Best. Age? Sex, male. Cultivation details? Species, human. Remarks, an old soul in a young body, or just a young man pretending to be a stoic. Lex frowned. The fact that even some information was available meant that the man did not have a system, which was unexpected. Lex stepped away from Fenrir and revealed himself, curious to see what kind of treatment he could get from this mysterious healer. 736 Quack Doctor. As Lex limped closer to the healer, he could hear in on the conversation the soldiers were having with him. Not a barbarian, I am a doctor. If you must stretch things, then at most I am somewhat of a shaman. I absolutely cannot enter the battlefield. If any soldiers require medical attention, you can bring them here. The situation does not allow for that. Screw the situation. I'll be no good to you dead, and that's exactly what I'll be if I enter the battlefield. If you're unable to hold the line, then just say that, and instead of finding me, begin evacuations. Now if you'll excuse me, I have patients to attend to. Lex frowned. The warning from his instincts was getting dire, and it seemed like the Empire was not able to get a handle on the situation. It was strange, though. According to Lex's understanding of the Empire, they should be fully capable of reacting to even an emergency such as this. His mind wandered towards the terrorists, who had been secretly as well as openly orchestrating the situation from behind the scenes. Maybe there was something else at play. Once Lex reached such a conclusion, he decided to wrap things up here. Although he wanted to help out as much as possible, especially since Alexander had originally asked for his help, one must also know when to retreat. But, despite the ever-increasing danger, Lex was sure he had enough time to test out this doctor first. Doctor, please, I need your help, Lex said, attracting the skinny young man's attention. The bones on my right side are crushed, the pain is overwhelming, he said, though honestly he had to admit, the painkiller given to ripping, to simply making him want to die immediately so that the pain would end. Of course, with his willpower as strong as it was, he was not about to do that. The doctor, ignoring the soldier attempting to be domineering, came towards Lex and without hesitation put his fingers on Lex's neck. An unusual yet warm energy flowed into his body, and for some odd reason, Lex felt like he wouldn't be able to block it even if he had tried. The doctor did not have any change of expression, but clearly he was alarmed by Lex's state as he abruptly started shouting at his assistants, the small children in the park. A whirlwind of activity surrounded Lex, and in a few moments, he found himself shirtless and laying on a bed of leaves, freshly laid out just for him. Inject 30 cc of gurling worm venom in the right arm, lather turbid root sap on his chest, and bring me a fresh bushel of baling berries, the doctor commanded as he began injecting his strange energy at various points across Lex's body. Does this count as acupuncture? He wondered as the energy effortlessly pierced his skin, and activated strange reactions across his body. Although Lex was not cultivating, his body started to absorb the ambient spirit energy, and it seemed to be disappearing somewhere unknown within his body. The kids proved to be competent nurses, as they quickly followed through the doctor's orders, though there was one tiny hiccup. When the kid tried to inject the venom into his arm, the needle broke, but Lex's skin remained smooth and flawless. Lex and the kid shared eye contact, but said nothing, as the embarrassed kid quickly changed needles. He tried again, only to fail once again, though admittedly, this time, the needle only bent and did not break. Doctor, sir, we have a problem, the kid said, scratching his head. the doctor noticed the issue with the needle, and took over. He did not replace the needle, but only coated it with his energy. This time even Lex was unaware of what the result would be. A moment later, the energy effortlessly entered his arm, yet the needle was still unable to pierce his skin. This time, Lex and the doctor shared eye contact, and Lex saw genuine surprise. "How the hell did you even get hurt?" the doctor asked, but then decided that he didn't care. "Here, take this, and inject it into your right arm. Do it yourself. I'm just a doctor, not some bodybuilder. Don't make me do such things." Lex smiled awkwardly, and used his nail to forcefully create a small cut on his right arm before quickly shoving the needle in, and injecting the venom. The doctor continued to use strange and rare local herbs to treat Lex's body, and the rate at which his body was absorbing spirit energy kept increasing. As strange and unbelievable as it was, Lex felt that the doctor's efforts were contributing nearly as much as the lotus in healing his body. After a short while, the doctor told Lex to continue lying down for a short while as he moved to treat his other patients, as his recovery would take a while. Lex complied, not because he expected to completely heal, but because he wanted to see what the doctor did to treat the poison. Although, regardless of whether he was able to get any results or not, Lex had already decided to hire this Dr. Charles Best to work at the inn. For a very long time, he had been looking for a doctor, as he did not want to limit his treatments to just the pods. Although he did not know the extent of Dr. Best's abilities, just that fact that he could speed up Lex's recovery was enough of a reason for him to be hired. Dr. Best moved towards a new soldier who had been brought in, and though he was bleeding heavily, it was the poison that was truly killing him. The good doctor had the soldier's shirt removed before. Lex did not know how to respond. The doctor stuck leeches on his chest, and put a small broken piece of chocolate in the soldier's mouth. The good impression of the doctor which Lex had built up took a nosedive, and Lex began to wonder if he was looking at the fabled quack doctor, who would write any prescription a patient wanted, and did things seemingly randomly. 737 Retreat. Despite Lex's hesitation towards the doctor's treatment, he continued to observe him for he was still working. The treatment method continued to remain highly unorthodox for he had a seeming aversion to any processed medication, and instead preferred to use ingredients in their most natural form. Unexpectedly, the treatment did not take long nor was it too overly complex. In a few minutes, the leeches fell off the man's chest and took on a green tinge, while the soldier's condition improved almost immediately. Given his current situation, Lex of course could not make an accurate judgment as to the extent of the treatment, but he was satisfied enough with what he had seen. Lex summoned Fenrir, and quickly disappeared from where he lay. As much as he hated to interfere with his healing process, but he had work to do. He changed into his suit, which automatically cleaned the lather which Lex had on his chest. "Find Alexander," he told Fenrir, and described him to the pup. Lex obviously had nothing on him which had Alexander's scent, so he would have to rely on scouring the battlefield instead. The duo quickly returned to the battlefield, and Lex immediately understood why the situation was getting worse rather than better. Although the original insect army had been diminished drastically by the angel-like immortal, more and more tiers were opening up and flooring the ground with even more insects. It was only a matter of time before more immortals also showed up. Although he expected that the Jotun army should have had the resources to combat this situation, perhaps he was not aware of the whole picture. It did not take long for them to find Alexander, partly because it was quite easy to spot his 6 flying blades, and partly because of how openly they were scouring the battlefield with their spirit sense. Moreover, they found him just in the nick of time, as he too seemed to be suffering greatly from the poison's effects. He was bleeding from his eyes and nose, and was kneeling on a single knee while his swords killed any insect that neared him. He was breathing heavily, and considering if he would be accused of desertion if he escaped to the inn right at that moment. "Need a hand?" asked an oddly familiar voice, though in his current state he could not exactly recall who it belonged to. He felt a force yanking him up, and before he knew it, he was atop Fenrir, and all the insects began ignoring him. He saw the face, and instantly a part of his drowsy mind clicked. I left a message for you to avoid Pulbitby, he said hoarsely. I'm glad you ignored it. I never got your message, I was here to begin with. I need your help. The situation here is bad, and it's getting worse by the second. There's little hope for evacuation under such a heavy assault, and I don't see reinforcements coming fast enough to change the situation. Everyone needs to escape to the inn, that's the only hope you have for avoiding a complete wipeout. Alexander's thoughts were slow, though it was unknown if it was due to the poison or if he had suffered a concussion during the battle. But even so, eventually he caught on to what Lex was saying. That decision can only be made by the current commander, he said. If it was my own squad head, I could have convinced her. But, as you probably saw, Valkyrie left after delivering a devastating attack. She probably has some other mission. Do you know who the current commander is? Yes, it's the immortal fighting off the other immortal insects, with the formation. They both paused the conversation and looked up in the sky, where the fight between the remaining immortals was still ongoing, albeit not as intensely as before. How about anyone we can actually talk to? Alexander tried to think of a solution, but he was not in the best state of mind. I can only think of someone else in my squad. Maybe they'll know. Lead on, we don't have time to waste. Due to the fact that they were once again on a manhunt, Alexander described the appearance of his superiors so that they could look. It did not take long before they found the first member of Alexander's squad, but he was already dead. Finding a second took some time, but fortunately, this one was alive, and even in better condition than Alexander. Though with his cultivation at the nascent realm, it only made sense that he had fared better. Captain Radomai, Alexander yelled, as he tried to get the man's attention. Lex did not want everyone to know about Fenrir's ability, so they got off, and the two wounded men fought their way to the captain. We can't go on like this, the situation is not improving. We have to retreat to the Midnight Inn. Music to my ears, boy, the captain yelled back, but the Valkyrie will have our hides if we retreat from battle. Better her than these insects. We have to convince command to retreat, there's no other choice. Even if we get them to agree, how can we actually get away? The burly man asked, dissecting another insect as he did. Before Alexander could answer, Lex summoned forth a bag full of hundreds of keys. You can use this, Lex said, handing the bag to Alexander. Will you be all right with him, or do you want to come with me? I have another task to take care of. I'll be fine with the captain. Don't worry, desertion or not, I have no intentions of dying here today. I'll go to the inn if the situation gets worse. Lex nodded, and separated from the two. He could only hope that whoever was in charge would agree, as the premonition of danger was growing genuinely worrisome now. Without wasting a second, he quickly got on Fenrir and hurried towards the good doctor, or rather, Dr. Best. 738 Grandpa. Charles Best was having a spectacularly bad day, which fit perfectly with the horrendous week that he just went through. For reasons he could not completely comprehend, he had reincarnated. His original identity was that of Shaman King from the Dark Elf race, but that was merely the most mundane identity he carried in his previous life. He was a third-generation elf, meaning he was only 2 generations down from the birth of the very first Dark Elf in this realm ever. As such, when he was born, the origin realm had only been stable for a little over 10,000 years, with its actual age being near 100 million years, as compared to now when it was already nearing 14 billion years. As a result, he was privy to certain secrets that remained unknown to most, and had experienced perhaps the most spectacular time for this realm. Any and every realm, upon its inception, was filled with the most potent form of spiritual energy, meaning chaos energy, and was too dangerous for normal species to be born. But that did not mean that no species were born at all. No, in fact, the younger the age of a realm, the more likely it was to give birth to what were categorized as mythical beings. They usually gave birth to extraordinarily powerful races, though their offspring scarcely ever reached the level of their primogenitors. Such was the case with elves, and it was similarly the case with dragons, phoenixes, and many prominent races. As the grandchild of a primo, so to speak, Charles had been exposed to knowledge and secrets that the races of today could not even begin to comprehend. So, it was quite ironic that Charles himself could not comprehend the reason for his reincarnation, though he strongly suspected it was related to the cause of his death. But the greater secrets of the universe be damned, for he was in no position to even consider them at the moment. Reincarnated as a human, a race he had never even heard of before, Charles was put in an extremely weak and frail body. Moreover, the spiritual energy of the realm was no longer able to support the kinds of cultivation techniques he already knew, meaning he would have to rely on the more modern, subpar techniques. Before he could get his affairs in order and begin his cultivation, Armageddon seemed to have descended on this place. If he did not use certain techniques that relied on external items as fuel to save himself, he would have died immediately when the poison spread. Had he mentioned that, on this entire forsaken planet, the body he had inhabited was even more pathetic than the rest of his race? For reasons unknown, the prior occupant of this body had not been able to cultivate at all during his life. At least Charles had a clean slate to begin his cultivation with when he finally picked what he wanted. But the issue now was, the artificial energy he had stored in the containers he had attached to his body was running out. When that happened, he would have no way to protect himself. He could only hope that by showing off his extensive knowledge of nature, he could be considered valuable enough by the human empire, and be rescued before anything too drastic happened. He had too much to live for. After all, he knew all the great secrets of the origin realm. He only needed a little bit of strength, and he could begin harvesting treasures that had spent billions of years in the making. His rise would be unstoppable. Just as Charles was worrying about his survival, daydreaming about his rise, and reminiscing about his past, he became aware of a massive white wolf standing right in front of him, and a human wearing some kind of devilish mask riding atop it. "Grandpa Fenrir," he could not help but suddenly exclaim as he fell to his knees, the shock of what he saw completely wiping his mind clear of all thoughts. But then a few seconds passed in awkward silence as neither side spoke, and everyone was wondering what was going on. Charles woke up, and realized the mistake he had made of letting his instinctual reaction get the better of him. But he also could not be blamed, for who could expect to see a wolf with such a pure bloodline 14 billion years after the origin realm had already been formed? His grandpa Fenrir was probably already dead, or had long since left the realm. Charles stood up and coughed to clear his throat, pretending as if his previous actions had never happened. "How can I help you? Do you also need treatment?" he asked, his expression and tone extremely professional. But, unfortunately, the devilish man did not play along. "You recognized Fenrir pretty quickly. Have you seen another wolf with the same bloodline before? But I was under the impression that this bloodline was pretty rare." It definitely had to be rare, for even though the system had many drawbacks, it never lied when it was concerned with its quest rewards. You named him Fenrir?" Charles asked, raising a trembling hand and pointing at the devilish man. "Do you know what you're doing?" Charles suddenly became weak in his legs. He had just been reborn, so why the hell was he encountering so many dangerous situations? The ignorant were truly bold, and dared to do anything. "Why? Is there a problem with giving it such a name?" the devilish man asked. His question made sense. Ordinarily, it was not a big deal regardless of what one was named. But that was only if one did not know about the mythical beings, and their corresponding powers over their bloodlines. If the wolf had been named Fenrir, and nothing amiss had happened to it, there were only a few possibilities Charles could think of. The first, and safest option was that Grandpa Fenrir truly was dead. The second, and quite a real possibility, was that Grandpa Fenrir had used certain laws to set up conditions for his own reincarnation. The third. Charles suddenly stopped trembling and looked at the devilish man as if trying to guess his identity. The third possibility was that behind this devilish man was someone even Grandpa Fenrir did not dare to mess with. Chapter 739, A Tear in Space. Lex had approached Dr. Charles with the intention of creating a strong impression on him, and getting him to take refuge with the Midnight Inn. But, from the very first instant, things had not gone the way he expected. It seemed like even without putting in any effort, the man had been thoroughly dominated. After all, he dropped to his knees and called Fenrir Grandpa. That was a feat Lex had not been able to accomplish even as the innkeeper, let alone as Lex. But all jokes aside, although Charles did not end up having a system, the man clearly had some secrets and unusual experiences. After all, he had directly called Fenrir by his name, and even addressed him by it. It was not so surprising that someone could guess Fenrir's name, for Lex had directly named him after his bloodline, but so far Charles was the only one who had had a significant reaction to his pup. Even if Lex was not interested in him for his medical knowledge, his familiarity with his pup's bloodline, and possibly even origin, made it so that he had successfully aroused all of Lex's attention. "There is no problem with such a name," Charles responded, having once again regained his composure. "It's just not every day that one takes on the name of a bloodline. It's very unoriginal." "So are you saying your grandpa did not do the same?" Lex asked, seeming as if he was completely calm and not in any rush at all. In truth, Lex knew that the sooner they left this planet, the better. The warning level from his instincts were getting very close to the level where Lex would leave without any hesitation. "I misspoke," Charles responded, refusing to comment on the matter. Some matters were best left unsaid, because he could not come up with a reasonable explanation for his answer. Was he supposed to confess that he knew and had met the real and original Fenrir? Lex pondered for a minute, but then decided there would be plenty of time to question the good doctor at a later time, as long as he joined the inn. "This planet is about to face a great danger, much greater than the one it is currently already facing," said Lex, based completely on his guess. "You can try to evacuate through the Empire, but I have a quicker solution for you." Lex threw a platinum key at the doctor, who caught it immediately. He sensed a familiar aura from the key, but he could not place where exactly he had felt it before. Regardless, the aura it gave off was worth speculating over. "I work for a place called the Midnight Inn. We cater and host guests from all across the universe. I've seen your medical skill, and I think you're good enough to recruit. If you crush the key, you can take a test to see if you too can become a member of the inn." At this point, Lex threw a golden key towards him too. "But, of course, joining is not mandatory. If you do not wish to join, you can simply leave this place by crushing the golden key. You'll be teleported over to the Midnight Inn, where you'll be able to escape whatever disaster is about to fall here. Of course, if you visit normally, you'll just be an ordinary guest, and you'll have to pay for your stay." With that, Lex decided to leave. One way or another, Charles was coming to the inn. Based on his behavior, Lex could see that he lacked the courage to endanger his life for very long. Moreover, although it seemed like Lex gave him the choice of whether to work at the inn or not, the reality was that that was not the case. If he visited as a guest, he would only be able to stay for a limited time, as he would eventually run out of MP. Then he would have to return to this planet, and based on how Lex saw things proceeding, it was unlikely the good doctor would want such a result. So, in the end, whether he used the platinum key now, or later, Lex was sure that ultimately he would end up using it. When he returned to the inn, Lex finally breathed a sigh of relief as the sensation of impending danger finally disappeared. "Mary, I have a potential new hire, coming in by the name of Charles. If he joins, have him treat all the poison patients. I have no other solution for the poison for now. If there's an emergency that requires my attention, wake me up. Otherwise, just manage things till I wake up." He passed on a few more instructions before he teleported away to his private recovery pod, got in, and went to sleep. Although it seemed like he was fine, the amount of pain he had tolerated was truly driving him to the verge of insanity. There was almost nothing that could prevent him from going to sleep and finally escaping his pain. An hour or so after Lex appeared, many soldiers also teleported over to the inn, all in a bad condition. The situation on the planet had truly deteriorated, and it was far worse than anything any of them could have expected. Simply speaking, a massive tear in space had opened up, and had engulfed the entire planet, teleporting it away. Such a scene was unprecedented and completely unheard of, and only the few who had evacuated to the inn or used the teleportation formations in advance to escape had survived. A day later, news finally spread as experts from across the realm approached the area and conducted an investigation. The insects that they had been fighting seemed to have been specifically bred for a single purpose, and surprisingly that purpose was not to fight. Their blood contained an unusual material that rapidly deteriorated the stability of space, considering that space in that area was already vulnerable in the first place. It seemed like, to erase his traces, the mastermind behind the eco-terrorism act had decided to remove the entire planet. Of course, he had further compromised the environment in the process as well, as the massive tear in space was now leaking chaos energy directly into the realm. As for what would happen next, no one knew. But the situation was far from over, as no one seemed to be able to trace the terrorist Jeffrey, including the Dowlords dispatched by the Henali. Chapter 740, Catch Up. 13 days after the incident, Lex suddenly woke up in his recovery pod. Unlike his usual retreats, Lex did not wake up refreshed and well-rested, but rather he felt like he was on the verge of dying from starvation. Although, he had indeed also healed. The lotus seemed to have gone back to sleep as well, for the warm sensation of the lotus healing him had already vanished. Unable to bear the hunger, Lex teleported over some food and immediately began eating while a part of his brain tried to understand what was happening to him. The changes to his body due to the new cultivation technique were many, and he was still only just understanding them. Originally, his hunger could usually be sated just using spiritual energy, but now it seemed like he also needed to replenish his reserves with food, and not just any ordinary food. The stash he was eating from now was a reserve he had created for himself, and contained extremely energy-abundant foods, all procured from the Emporium. Even then, this was only barely helping him slowly sate his hunger. "Mary, what happened while I was asleep? Did Charles join the inn?" "Lex, a lot has happened while you slept." Yes, Charles did eventually join the inn, but only after Pulbitby was completely teleported away, and all his accumulated wealth disappeared, leaving him broke. Mary began to inform Lex of all that had happened recently. The state of things had escalated so much that it had transcended just the Pendal galaxy, and, oddly enough, the number of guests had ironically dropped. No one was in the mood for a vacation in such a tense time. Everyone was returning to take care of important things that could not be put off. As it turned out, what had happened at Pulbitby was only just the start. Similar terrorist acts were carried out across the entire realm. Countless planets were then similarly teleported away using the same method. At first, everyone assumed that causing massive tears in space was a way for the terrorist to hide his trail, but once the method was replicated multiple times, many began to suspect that there was still more to the matter than there appeared, and indeed a week later, the suspicions were proven true. Before the tears could completely heal, even under the efforts of Dowlords, they became points at which the Fugan infiltrated into the realm. If the Dowlords wanted, they could have forcefully destroyed all the infiltrating Fugan, but that would have further compromised the integrity of space in that region. The entire realm had entered a state of emergency, and the Henali were finally beginning to take action personally. Only they knew the heavy investments they had put into ensuring the maximum organic growth of this realm, and if external interference ruined that, then their losses would be immense. These two were only the things Mary knew of, because she had heard multiple devils discussing the matters openly. Speaking of whom, the devils had become the race to most frequent the inn these days. If one did not know better, it would seem like the inn was a devil's retreat. As if all that was not enough. "Charles has been bothering me every day. He really wants to meet the innkeeper. According to him, the medical treatments that the inn offers are too subpar, and he wants to change the whole system. Moreover, his ideas extend far beyond just the field of medicine. Moreover, he's been pestering Fenrir nonstop as well. He has not even spared the galactic sovereign turtle, and keeps insisting that the turtle needs to obey him if it wants to maximize its growth. As if that was not enough, he thoroughly scolded Lady Anita, and gave her proper instructions on how to raise a baby Cthulhu, saying that the baby was extremely malnourished. In the past few days, He has also prescribed an extensive meal plan personalized to over 700 of the inn's employees, stating that their body's development is stunted. Once he actually fought with one of the guests, saying that they were doing their bloodline a disservice by becoming obese, and became a personal trainer for that particular devil. Although there were no complaints registered against him for that incident, I have thoroughly reprimanded him for it. Moreover, the inn's mechanic, Xeon, heard that Charles was boasting extensive knowledge about bloodlines and medicine, so he approached him and asked if Charles could help him evolve into a true dragon. Charles agreed, and since then has been running various tests on Xeon. Since it's with Xeon's own consent, I cannot really stop him, but I can't help but think he's trying to swindle the poor fellow. Those are just some of the prominent things Charles has done that I thought deserved mentioning. He has been extremely active, so he's done a lot more. He's been spending a lot of time observing the sleeping mountain man, though fortunately he hasn't done anything to him yet. But the way he keeps looking at him, it just makes me nervous for some reason. The tiny floating Mary, who was dressed up in a toga, shivered for a moment, but then regained her composure. Other than Charles, there are many matters that need your attention. For one, there is a massive number of devils who wish to meet you and have been asking for appointments. Rocketfellow Rothsfather is also one of them, and he's ready to begin the 5 trillion MP event he mentioned previously, but just wants to speak with you first about a few things. John is also back from the murder grounds, but he suffered incredibly. His entire cultivation seems to have disappeared and he seems very destitute. He wants to talk to you. Last, but not least, Alexander has left a letter for Lex, as well as a spatial ring. I'm not sure what that's about, but you can ask him whenever you want. Since he teleported over from Polbitvi, and the entire planet disappeared, he kind of got stuck at the inn, like many other soldiers. Temporarily, they have been shifted to the minor realm that the Empire is in charge of protecting, but finding a way to send those people back somehow is also something you should think about.